Okay, so perhaps we have to start off. Yeah. So welcome everyone. I welcome you all to this second plenary session on within this conference, international conference on teaching ecumenism in the context of world Christianity. This very plenary is titled Catholicity, Contextuality, and Conciliarity in the Changing Landscape in Ecumenism. Catholicity, Contextuality, and Conciliarity in the Changing Landscape in Ecumenism. My name is Lawrence Iwamade of the Ecumenical Institute. We already met yesterday, and I will be the moderator of this session. The question of contextuality, Catholicity, and conciliarity has been an old age question in ecumenism, but it's become all the more important and more at the forefront with all the talks of the shift of the globe, the center of gravity of global Christianity, and also the rise of studies of global world Christianity in institutions of learning. And so how does ecumenism deal with the Catholicity and the contextuality of various realities, and then conciliarity? So to tackle this question or this very theme today, we have with us, I would say, three eminent personalities, professors who have been in the field of ecumenism from different perspectives. So we have Professor Dr. Christophe Chalamet, who will be speaking on Catholicity and conciliarity as challenges for Christian churches today. Professor Dr. Dorothea Sattler, who will speak on being Roman Catholic today in a worldwide context, ecumenical perspectives on confessional reform efforts. And Reverend Dr. Gabrin, who will speak on church unity and theological education in China. The session we have is a 90-minute session, and we will follow almost the same pattern that we had yesterday. So each of the presenters has 20 minutes for the presentation. We will take the three presentations at a go. After that, we will then move into the questions and discussions that follow. And so Professor Dr. Christophe Chalamet is of the University of Geneva, Switzerland. So he is here, and he is also known to BOSE and to the World Council of Churches. He teaches our students. He is Reformed Presbyterian, professor of systematic theology at the University of Geneva's Theological Faculty, which was founded by John Calvin in 1559. His research focuses on some of the main themes of Christian theology, especially from the ecumenical perspective. These themes include theological virtues, Trinitarian theology, and the theology of the covenant. Prior to his appointment in Geneva, he taught at Fordham University, New York City, from 2003 until 2011. His latest publications include A Most Excellent Way, an essay on faith, hope, and love, published in 2020. And then he edited another work, The Challenge of History, Readings in Modern Theology, published by Fortress 2020 as well. So it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Dr. Christophe Chalamet. And Christophe, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Lawrence. First, I would like to say a word of thanks to the organizers of this conference for their invitation. It is an honor to take part in this panel. I speak to you from Lausanne, Switzerland, a city known for hosting not just a major evangelical meeting on the topic of world evangelization in 1974, but also, and more importantly, perhaps for our purposes, the first World Conference on Faith and Order in August 1927. Most of the Christian churches in the West were present, with the exception of the Roman Catholic Church, which had yet to embrace the ecumenical movement at the time. Almost a century later, we certainly see the limitations of such conferences held by citizens mostly of Western colonial powers. Yet these landmark events, with all of their shortcomings and limitations, remain significant stages on a path that has broadened considerably in the last century in terms of geographical inclusivity. The topic on which I will speak today is vast: Catholicity and conciliarity as challenges for Christian churches today. In what follows, I will only touch on certain points. First, Catholicity. I belong to a tradition within Protestantism, the Reformed or Presbyterian tradition, in which this word is often looked at with a measure of suspicion. For many Protestants, to speak of Catholicity means approaching the realm of Roman Catholicism. And this is very unfortunate, for the term Catholicity, as is well known, is a beautiful term, which means universal, but also etymologically, according to the whole, bound to the whole, katholon. Some significant leaders of the ecumenical movement, leaders who happened to be Protestants, have sought to retrieve this term. They spoke of an evangelical Catholicity. Nathan Söderblom, the Lutheran bishop of Uppsala, was among those who spoke in this way. One of the main challenges for us today is to overcome all antagonism or separation between the local church and the universal church, so as to see the intrinsic link between the local and the universal. The universal church is present in each and every local church in which the gospel is preached and the sacraments administered. Each local church is connected to the one church, to Christ's body, which is one body. In and from particular churches comes into being the one and only Catholic Church. We read these words in Lumen Gentium in paragraph 23. In quibus et ex quibus, una et unica ecclesia catholica existit. When Pope Francis visited a small Valdensian parish in Turin, Italy, Torino, in June 2015, he visited a member of Christ's body, a member of the Church Universal. There, in that small parish, was and is found the universal church. It was not simply the visit of a Christian of a higher order or status to a church lacking essential elements of the Christian faith, as I see it. It was rather the visit of a Christian brother who undoubtedly has been entrusted with very high responsibilities to other Christian brothers and sisters. And here is what he said to them in a remarkable gesture of humility. On behalf of the Catholic Church, I ask your forgiveness. I ask your forgiveness for unchristian-like and even inhuman attitudes and conduct, which historically we have had against you. In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, forgive us. End of quote. In some ways, Protestantism started in the first decades of the 16th century. But isn't it the case that the Protestant reformers did not see themselves at all as creating a new church, but instead, as others had done before them, but without necessarily ending up with a break or a schism, as attempting to reform the one universal church? The case of the Waldensians actually confirms this link between the Reformation and earlier reformatory movements, including Pierre Valdo's medieval movement in the 12th and early 13th century, since Pierre Valdo died in 1217. For all the talk among Protestants about sola scriptura, the Protestant reformers were completely steeped in the theology of late Middle Ages and in patristic theology, Greek and Latin. To them, sola scriptura never meant solitaria scriptura. They were constantly trying to convince critics that they were not inventing anything new, but only attempting to retrieve the gospel that indeed in many quarters had been placed under a bushel. Christianity is often taken to be a European phenomenon, especially by Europeans themselves. Here, the decolonizing of the Eurocentric mind of which we heard yesterday is indeed crucial. Amazingly and distressingly, Europeans often view Christianity as their thing, as if it had originated with them or in their regions. They forgot, and they still forget, that they were, and to a significant extent still are, pagans. With the extraordinary and rapid changes we have seen and still see today, that is, with a mainstream Christianity that is crumbling rapidly in many Western European countries, and with the astonishing growth of new forms of Christianity in many regions of the world, we are all challenged to consider Catholicity in a new light. Or at least we are all urged to ask ourselves as individuals, but also as members of Christ's body, how our respective churches relate to the one universal church. This question goes in all directions. It is addressed to the Western churches, asking them how they relate to the new forms of Christianity that are growing exponentially. And conversely, it is asking these new Christian communities to relate to the Western churches despite the very mixed bag, to put it very mildly, of their colonizing history, of the Western church, the Western nations' colonizing history. This question matters and ought to be considered at various levels, at the regional level, at the global level, within our own denomination or Christian confession, but also in relation to the other Christian confessions. Here, teaching ecumenism means, at least in part, asking ourselves what is Catholic about our faith, our worship, the life of our local community, asking ourselves how in all of these realms we are reminded, or perhaps not, of the universality of the church. The universality of the church is both a gift and a task. We do not have to create it. It is there, it has been there since the earliest days of the Christian church in the wake of Pentecost. We therefore can rely on it as a basis for ecclesial existence, just as Christians who lived before us did. The universality of the church, however, is not just a gift, it is also a task, and an important one. If the church is universal, this means it is one and the same everywhere in some way. But empirical reality strikes a very different note. With our own eyes, we do not see a church which is one and the same everywhere. What we see is an incredibly fragmented church, shattered in a multiplicity of churches. This is, of course, the constant theme of ecumenical theology, how the one church relates to the many churches, how the many churches relate to the one church. My point is quite simply that to speak of the Catholicity of the church implies that there is only one church, one body. To speak of the Catholicity of the church is another way of signaling the sin of separation and conflict, the sin of a multiplicity without unanimity. There certainly is a sound way of coexisting in plurality, but we Christians cannot boast of having found it or of living according to it. We live as separated sisters and brothers who, despite the immense efforts that have been made, at least since 1910, Edinburgh, 1927, Lausanne, and other events, do not share in the meal that the Lord instituted on the eve of his passion. Plurality that ignores, that tramples unanimity is not sound plurality, is not the kind of plurality God intends, it seems to me. Note that I am talking here of unanimity and not of uniformity, which has undoubtedly been a wrong-headed intention from the part of Western Christians, that is, to shape Christians all around the world as if they too were Westerners, or better, as if they too needed to become Westerners. Indeed, we need to crucify such intentions. I draw here, of course, on Miguel de la Torre's contribution. But unanimity is a very high aim. We can see how such an aim is so difficult to approximate, not to mention achieve or attain. In the New Testament, the central gift, the central event, is the becoming near of God's kingdom. This event, in turn, calls for conversion, metanoia. I would say that this applies to Catholicity, since Catholicity is among the good gifts of God, for the people of God is one across all countries and continents, since the Christian faith is one, since baptism is one, since the Lord is one. Then this gift inevitably entails a conversion from our part, from the part of all Christians who are led to ask themselves and to ask each other what in our own Christian community, in our local church as well as in our regional and worldwide church, blocks unanimity, a shared confession of the faith, a common witness. What is it that makes it difficult or impossible for my church, as of now, to be united in confession, in faith, and in practice with other Christians? In order to begin to answer these questions, we need to hear from one another. A dialogue and also a debate need to occur. People from all regions of the world should and must be invited and even urged to join in this dialogue, peacefully urged, of course, to join in this dialogue and in this debate. They should also be able not just to listen in on conversations or to take part in discussions, but also to set the agenda of such discussions. And this leads me to my second topic, conciliarity. This term has become a buzzword. It is on everybody's lips, especially among theologians, among progressive theologians perhaps, and especially among progressive Roman Catholic theologians, as a matter of fact. Pope Francis has signaled at the outset of his papal office that synodality, which of course is a synonym of conciliarity, would be a high priority of his papacy. And certainly, it appears that the Roman Catholic Church could use more synodality in its various bodies at all levels, and not just among the cardinals or the bishops. Some significant attempts have been made in various dioceses and even at the national level, as in Germany. At the same time, the Roman Catholic Church has given an extraordinary witness of the process of Reformation 60 years ago or so, during its own shape-altering council, Vatican II, which really was an extraordinary event, even if the global Roman Catholic Church was barely beginning to be represented in Rome at the time. But here one may recall the great figure, among others, of Dom Helder Camara, the Brazilian Archbishop of Olinda and Recife, someone who remains a source of inspiration. Protestants, who are used to say that the church is always in a state of reforming itself, saw what that can mean concretely and quite visibly in a sister church rather than in their own church, and in a sister church that seemed to be immutable and unlikely to reform. They also saw how such a process can be halted and hampered by subsequent decisions over several decades. The Orthodox had been discussing the possibility of a pan-Orthodox council for decades, as can be seen from the many meetings that were held often at the Orthodox Center in Chambézy, not far from the World Council of Churches in Geneva. In January of 2016, all of the major primates leading the Orthodox Communion met in Chambézy to finalize plans for a pan-Orthodox council to be held in Crete in June of 2016. But synodality or conciliarity is everything but easy. And the world saw a confirmation of the difficulty of practicing fellowship when political ambitions or pressures intrude, as they often and arguably always do in the life of the church. What we need is synodality at all levels within our respective churches, from the local congregation to the international bodies or the see of these churches. But this is not enough. We cannot be content to talk amongst ourselves as Lutherans, as Methodists, as Orthodox, as Pentecostals, or as Catholics. We need to talk to one another. In January 1920, an encyclical letter issued by the Patriarchate of Constantinople, an important document in the history of ecumenism in the 20th century, urged, quote, the convening of pan-Christian conferences to examine questions of common interest to all churches, 1920. The point of conciliarity is not to accept views such as racism, white supremacy, Western hegemony, misogyny, xenophobia, or homophobia, views that we rightly deem utterly contrary to the gospel. The point of conciliarity is not to embrace arrogant philosophies and worldviews that are unjust, that contradict in frontal, direct ways the reconciling ways of God in Jesus Christ. The point of conciliarity, rather, is to discuss and debate what it means to be part of Christ's body today, what it means to confess the Christian faith together today. It is in part because we disagree and do so vigorously on a number of issues that we need to sit together, or rather walk together, synodos, and talk with one another. The point of conciliarity is not simply to change the other, but to allow myself to be changed in this encounter, on this path that we walk on together. The notion that ecumenism is impossible or irrelevant because we disagree about basic issues such as the human dignity of all human beings and the respect creation requires from us all is short-sighted in my view. It is precisely because we are not one that we are on a quest for a greater, deeper unity, a unity that in no way cancels difference, but that helps us learn to envision unity precisely in diversity, not beyond diversity. Where and when can this happen? And here I have a section in which I would have talked about various places, but I have to skip probably. What I can say is that we are provoked to walk with one another, despite all of the stumbling blocks on the path. The French theologian and reformer, John Calvin, wrote that the church, quote, is so holy that it daily makes progress and has not yet its perfection. Daily it moves forward. It has not attained the goal of holiness. I think these words are important. If I had the time to talk about places, locations, I would talk, of course, about Bossé. I would talk about the Global Christian Forum. I would talk about the 11th General Assembly that is set to meet in Karlsruhe, or to occur in Karlsruhe. But I think I have to skip, and I will finish with a few more words. Being a disciple of Jesus Christ entails a deep, always renewed humility, like the one Pope Francis showed in Torino, in a small Valdensian parish. I do not have in view the kind of humility that focuses on love to the detriment of truth, since these two cannot be severed. But conversely, too often truth has been disconnected from both love and service, also by Christians, in order to be used as an instrument of power and domination. Being disciples of Jesus Christ entails the kind of humility that seeks to listen to the other, to the sister and the brother in Christ, to atheists, people who have something valuable to tell us, teach us, wherever they may come from, whatever their level of education. Here I would have a section on liturgy and theological institution of higher learning as places where Catholicity and conciliarity can and perhaps ought to be taught, but I will finish with a few quotes. As the participants in the 1927 Conference on Faith and Order in Lausanne put it, we must labor in penitence and faith to build up our broken walls. With faith stimulated by God's guidance to us here, we move forward. And a final word from Pope Francis, who said in Torino in June 2015, our communion is still in progress. Unity is achieved while walking, end of quote. And so let us continue to walk with one another on this common path. Thank you to the organizers for your invitation, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Christophe. Thank you for this great presentation. It's to unpack it. I know it's not easy for within 20 minutes, but you have given us actually a tool to something to begin to work on as we reflect on Catholicity, contextuality, and conciliarity. We are challenged to consider Catholicity in a new light. And the spirit of Catholicity is another way of signaling the sin of our separation. And then the call for humility that doesn't detach from seeking the truth. Thank you, Christophe. And we will move now to the next speaker. For our audience, you keep your questions. All the questions will come afterwards at the end of the three presentations. And the next speaker is Professor Dr. Dorothea Sattler of the University of Münster, Germany. Born in Koblenz, Germany, Professor Dr. Dorothea Sattler studied Catholic theology and Romance philology at the University of Freiburg and University of Mainz. After her doctorate in 1992 in Catholic theology at the University of Mainz, she went ahead to earn her postdoctoral degree, habilitation, in 1996 in dogmatic theology and ecumenical theology at the same university. She was a visiting professor at Free University of Berlin, 1996 to 1998, full professor for systematic theology at the University of Wuppertal, 1998 to 2000. And since the year 2000, she has been a full professor for dogmatic theology and ecumenical theology at the University of Münster. Professor Sattler is also the director of the Ecumenical Institute at the Faculty of Catholic Theology at the University of Münster. It is my pleasure to invite Professor Sattler to present her paper on being Catholic today in a worldwide context, ecumenical perspectives on confessional reform efforts. Professor Sattler, please.
So, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this encounter with you in the worldwide Christian community these days. In my view, teaching ecumenism primarily consists in encouraging one another to learn ecumenism, with many people in many places at all times and again and again. Teaching and learning mutually enriching process that never ends. So up to now, you know, I have some difficulties to speak English. I studied French, but I tried to do it, and I read my text, and we will see. I need your help, but I hope you understand what I like to tell you. Being Roman Catholic today in a worldwide context, ecumenical perspectives on confessional reform efforts. The topic of my contribution may seem out of date, antiquated to you. I will speak about a denominational community. I will confer to intra-denominational issues. I will talk about my own denomination. I give a self-assessment. For a long time, it was usual to write ecumenical textbooks in which we thought that we could speak in general terms about every denomination. Today, it usually happens differently. We speak of our own tradition. We listen to each other. What am I going to do today? I have prepared 7 theses and I add some explications. I would like to familiarize you with the current reform process in the Roman Catholic Church. You will be aware that the various forms of sexual violence and spiritual abuse in the Roman Catholic Church have caused deep shocks around the world. There are also financial scandals and unfortunately much more horrible in my Roman Catholic Church. The evil in one's own church becomes perceptible on the structural level. I will start with the first of my 7 theses. Ecumenical learning happens when listening to the stories members of Christian denominations tell about themselves. In my experience, the situation in ecumenical teaching changes completely if people of a denomination are present, if people who are authentically capable of providing information are present. We then no longer talk about each other. We then talk to each other. In many areas of theological studies of the universities and in further formations of educations, in my opinion, this still happens too rarely. The denominational education systems around the world do not always open up opportunities for joint courses. In many Roman Catholic seminaries around the world, where priests are educated, only Roman Catholic teachers are teaching. This is not good. The authentic word and the personal encounter between people of different denominations is very important in the time of formation. My impression is, after so many decades of ecumenical movement, we still know not enough about each other, far too little. In Germany, we started in a multilateral ecumenical context the process of visiting each other when we celebrate the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. Come and see, come and see. We answer to the invitation of Jesus. We come and see where the others live. So my first thesis or option is, it is important to perceive each other with all the needs and fears, also with the joy and hope that is alive in every denominational community. The second thesis is, The current global process of reform in the Roman Catholic Church is a very good opportunity to learn more about the presence of this church as one member of the Christian community. Who doesn't know who is Pope? When Pope Francis was elected, I was at an ecumenical meeting and I was invited to give a lecture that evening. Nobody wanted to hear me, my words about 10 years Carta Ecumenica signed in Germany, 2003. Nobody. Why? Because it was indicated that white smoke would soon rise. Together, we sat in a multilateral ecumenical community in front of the television, and we heard the first words of Pope Francis, Buonasera. Pope Francis sent the worldwide Roman Catholic Church on a synodal path very soon after the beginning of his pontificate. Difficult and controversial topics should be dealt with it. There are now synodal processes in Germany and in other countries. Recently, the schedule for a worldwide synodal process has been announced. It is currently the question whether the clear options that are articulated in German-speaking countries are also considered by the world church as still Roman Catholic, especially with regard to the participation of women in all services and offices in the church. Why talking about these inner Roman Catholic processes is important in the context of ecumenical formation. In ecumenical teaching, it is important not only to acquire knowledge, but also to accompany paths in other denominations with empathy. We are happy for one another and we complain to one another. In ecumenism, we are also welcome mutual correction for one another. We strengthen each another and we admonish each another. All of us every time oriented towards the one gospel of Jesus Christ. One result, the third thesis, one result of ecumenical learning is controversies not only exist between denominations, but within the denominations. There are cultural differences and not always primarily theological aspects that are decisive in forming differences. Many denominations are faced with great challenges in their internal space with regard to their self-image as a community with denominational identity. The plurality of standpoints within each denomination is very large, and the alliances are made across the denominations. The topics that give rise to controversy are primarily individual questions in the area of sexual ethics and gender anthropology, women and men in church offices, same-sex partnerships, and so on. Even in the ethical assessment of forms of life at the beginning and at the end of human existence, denominational boundaries cannot always be identified. In addition to these ethical topics, there are often controversial views on the understanding of church constitutions, structures, and ministries. It is an open question how unanimity will ever be achieved, especially on issues of anthropology, and ethics, both. Biographical experiences and culture's influences form consciousness. This is the background of the observation that coalitions, I don't know to say it, coalitions are being formed across confessional lines around the world. A stronger regionalization of the Christian confessional traditions could take this fact into account and lead to an ecumenical understanding in the respective living spaces. So I'm sorry, but I tried to read my text. So my fourth thesis, ecumenical learning always leads to the reflection. The basis, shape, and aim of the unity of the churches is lived communion in following Christ Jesus. The Roman Catholic ecumenical hermeneutics decided by the Second Vatican Council took a turn from an ecclesiological to a soteriological orientation, even in ecumenism, soteriological turn. Salvation from the entanglement of guilt and death is a good divine gospel. Whoever does the service of the proclamation of this gospel, he or she lives in ecumenical life. I understand the recent efforts to renew the appreciation of baptism, as well as the talk of the new missionary awakeness of ecumenism in this context. The gift of God is the transition from death to life, Pascha. Spiritual experiences are consciously lived events in which people are led into the depths of their existence. In the power of the Holy Spirit, we can find a trustworthy, believing answer. Anyone who has ever experienced that other people of other denomination can give credible and appealing impression to the answer they themselves have found in the common questions about life will no longer miss the charm of spiritual togetherness. Life leaves a lot to be desired. Together, it is easier to step into the darkness of existence, to consider inevitable death and the burden of sin. Only in community can the light of trust in the God of life be guarded. The fifth thesis, in ecumenical learning, it is important to appreciate the different methodological paths in the ecumenical movement. To work together for a better world and to have theological discussions. These two ways of ecumenism do not contradict each other. There is unrivaled coexistence of social ecumenism and dialogue ecumenism. Looking for convergences and social ecumenism. From my point of view, there's little awareness that there are two profiled areas of action that are by no means alternative in view of the totality of the people involved in the ecumenical movement. In a single human life, we have to make one's choice. At the same time, and for good reasons, nobody can realize all options. Many factors have an impact on the personal choice of the respective ecumenical engagement. The simultaneity of the different forms and action in the common focus on the one gospel is a strength of ecumenism. doctrine and service are important. Doctrine and service. From my point of view, the aspect of urgency has to be experienced in this context. There are places and times when it is important to act immediately and not to speak anymore. The common ground in the search for answers to this question is a biblical scripture. In them, God meets with the promise of life in fullness in communion with Him. God's instructions aim to respect the foundations of life for all creatures. So, my sixth thesis, ecumenical learning, is always connected with the question of what the aim of the ecumenical movement can be. The ecumenical movement is more aware than ever that there is no common aim. There are many human ways and one divine horizon. Personalities with their peculiarities and diverging locations shape ecumenical theology more than other areas. Who would know from us which church leaders will shape the ecumenical movement in the future? All who call themselves Christians stand under the word of God. The credibility of testimony for Jesus Christ depends on the unity of his disciples, John 17:21. God's Spirit will always be an effective reminder of this. All the churches are called on a path to their visibly unity, so it is confirmed in many ecumenical documents. What does it mean? Visible unity. It will take some time, or isn't it the right aim? In 2001, the churches in Europe committed themselves to this aim, visible unity in the Carta Ecumenica. My last very brief seventh thesis is teaching ecumenism and learning ecumenism is an enrichment every day. Today, I thank you all. I learn ecumenism worldwide with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dorothea. Thank you for this presentation. You have, in a short time, taken us and raised core questions that actually Christians and scholars, ecumenists should not overlook when dealing with the question of Christian unity today. And you rightly mentioned that despite all the history of ecumenism, we still have a lot to learn from each other. There is the need for us to learn from each other. Listening to the stories of others, and as well, you raised the question of new issues that are still dividing the churches. Ethical questions, for instance, the cultural challenges that are there, but then the importance of lived community. So you highlighted this, and also the importance of social ecumenism. At the end of it, in ecumenism, what is the aim of ecumenism? What can we do ourselves? And I think the end word is that ecumenism or Christian unity is a gift of God. So as human beings, we make ourselves instruments in the hands of God. Thank you, Professor Dorothea. And we will go to the third presenter that we have this afternoon, Reverend Dr. Gabrin. Dr. Wenge was born in Liaoning in China, and he holds a PhD from Aarhus University, Denmark. He has been a teacher of theology in Nanjing Union Theological Seminary since 2001. He holds the position of Associate General Secretary of the China Christian Council since 2018. He is a former Bosset student and current member of the World Council of Churches Ecumenical Education and Formation Commission. His research interests include systematic theology and sociology of religion. He is the current translator of the Faith and Order paper, The Church Towards a Common Vision. He translated this into Chinese. His other publications include Engaging University Theologies with Church Theologies, a post-liberal appraisal of the emerging Sino-Christian academic theology. This is published in What Young Asian Theologians Are Thinking. He also have a recent publication, In Search of Ecclesial Identity of the Post-Denominational Churches, a case study of the contemporary Chinese ecumenical theology in the making. This is published in Asia Journal of Theology, volume 29. And he also published Building Up the Church in a Socialist Country, an examination of Bishop K.H. Teng's Chinese social theology in Yearbook of Chinese Theology in 2017. It is my pleasure to present Reverend Dr. Gabrin, who will be speaking to this question from under the title, Church Unity and Theological Education in China. Reverend Dr. Wenge, please.
Thank you very much. Dear brothers and sisters, greetings. I'm Wenge from Nanjing Union Theological Seminary. Thank you very much indeed for the privilege and great opportunity to share with you how ecumenism is taught at seminaries of the Chinese Uniting Protestant Churches. My topic is church unity and theological education in China, with special reference to the teaching of ecumenism in Nanjing Union Theological Seminary. What is ecumenism? In a narrow sense, it usually refers to the modern movement of seeking visible church unity in this world. But the Greek word oikumene, meaning the whole inhabited world, enables us to imagine a wider scope of the unity, including God, humankind, and the world. That is the wider sense of ecumenism. In ancient Chinese philosophy, we have a corresponding phrase that is all under heaven. The Chinese Confucian scholar Chen Lai points out the cosmological difference between Western and Chinese culture, as he says, compared with modern Western mechanical worldview, the cosmology in ancient Chinese classical civilization highlights not a static, isolating, material, and self-centered worldview with the dualistic tension or dichotomy of the subject and the object, but a continuous, dynamic, correlative, and holistic worldview. Taking this organic holism as a point of departure, we know that all in the universe are interrelated and interdependent, and all manifest their existence and value by means of their interaction with one another. Therefore, a harmonious coexistence should be established between human beings and nature, between one another and between different cultures. So when Chinese Christians talk about ecumenism, we're not only thinking about the visible Christian unity in this world, but also the world of greater harmony, or the cosmic shalom, as both symbolized in the creation narrative of Genesis and as promised in the book of Revelation. When we mention ecumenism, the cosmic dimension has always been there. So in this light, it should not be understood simply as a modern movement with the unity of humankind at its horizon, especially when globalization with obvious Western economic cultural characteristics started to dominate the world. And the concept of ecumenism itself is all-embracing, and the holistic mission of the Church in the process of seeking visible unity already points to the eschatological vision of the cosmic shalom and the greater harmony. In this light, teaching ecumenism in China means to equip students not only to strive for the visible unity of the churches as mandated by Jesus Christ before his departure from this world in John 17, but also to fulfill the greater harmony of the world, which includes the unity of humankind, and to realize the cosmic shalom. It points to a cosmotheandric whole and an inclusive and holistic salvation. As Leslie Newbigin says, the very meaning of the word salvation is that it is a making whole, a healing of that which sunders us from God, from one another, and from the created world. The idea of a salvation that is completed experience for each of us privately, apart from the consummation of all things, is a monstrous contradiction in terms. Or, as Jürgen Moltmann succinctly summarizes, salvation is whole salvation and the salvation of the whole. God would like to invite all his creation back to the Trinitarian communion of love. Thus, how this kind of ecumenism, understood from the Chinese perspective, is taught at Chinese seminaries. Theological education at church-run seminaries mainly aims to serve the Chinese churches. Theological education and the church development are inseparable. So I shall first set the contextual stage by offering a brief historical sketch of the Chinese Protestant Uniting Churches and theological education since 1949, when the People's Republic of China was founded. At that time, because of the confusion of colonialism and the cross, as well as the confusion of Western culture and Christianity in Western mission, Chinese Christians were criticized for standing on the side of the colonizers and imperialists. At this crucial moment, the prophetic Chinese church leaders in 1950 launched the well-known Three Self-Patriotic Movement to cut off the relationship with the foreign mission societies and to get identified and reconciled with the Chinese people first. As you all know, the three self principle, that is self-support, self-propagation, and self-administration, is not the invention of the Chinese churches, but coined by Henry Van as the missional policy for local churches in 19th century. But this resolve enabled the Chinese Christians to claim the authority or the sovereignty over our own churches. Missionaries had to leave, and they left. This moratorium of Western missionaries and financial support provided space for the Chinese churches to establish its own national identity and to shape our own selfhood. David Payton called this moratorium God's judgment on Eurocentric mission in 1953. And this moratorium partly prompted Chinese Christians of various former denominational backgrounds to cooperate and merge together. In 1958, union worship started in the Chinese churches, which marked a great progress in the journey of seeking church unity. In 1980s, the Chinese churches are in the post-denominational stage, with a few conciliar agreements on the principles to deal with church unity issues. This is widely welcomed and accepted by Christians of various former denominational backgrounds. The official church regulations was issued in 1996 in order to strengthen the ecclesiality of the Church Council and the TSPM at various levels into a real uniting church. And the regulations was revised in 2008 and 2018 respectively, which is of great significance for the ecclesiality of the Chinese uniting churches. So far, the Chinese churches have developed very fast, especially in the last 4 decades. In 1949, there are only 700,000 Protestant Christians in China. But according to the statistics of 2018, there are over 38 million Protestant Christians, 57,000 church pastors and preachers, and 60,000 churches and meeting points. And today, the Chinese churches keep growing, and we also cherish very much the unity that the Chinese churches have reached so far. The three self principle also enable Chinese churches to do a fourth self, that is self-theologization. In 1998, the Chinese churches launched the movement of theological thinking reconstruction, aiming to construct Chinese contextual theology. And beginning from 2013, the Chinese churches continue with these contextual efforts, but adopts a more inclusive term, that is the syncretization of Christianity, which covers 4 dimensions. That is the political identity, social adaptation, enculturation, and mutual respect among religions in China. Seminaries are regarded as the research basis to continue to study and promote Christian unity in China and contribute to the ecumenical movement. Theological education in China concurred with the development of church unity. In 1950s, merging of seminaries also took place. For example, Nanjing Union Theological Seminary was established in 1952 with 12 seminaries of different denominational background, either conservative or liberal, came together in the spirit of mutual respect. And since 1981, new seminaries have also been gradually established. Now there are altogether 21 Protestant theological seminaries, and Nanjing Seminary is the only one at the national level, which not only enrolls students from all parts of China, but also the only one that confers master's and doctor's degree. Theological education in China, generally speaking, is under the guidance of Theological Education Commission of the National China Christian Council. The teaching purpose of different seminaries and Bible colleges in China cannot go against the uniting nature of the Chinese Protestant churches. So, how is ecumenism is taught in my seminary? First of all, the perspective of ecumenism is introduced in the seminary teaching. We encourage the students to think not only contextually, but also ecumenically, without simply repeating Western ideas. We used to offer a course of Ecumenical Movement in the undergraduate program, and the course of Ecumenical Theology appears in the curriculum of the doctoral program. We try to lead students to think both ecumenically and contextually. For example, when teaching church history, we remind students how Reverend Nanjing spoke at the Edinburgh Conference, Mission Conference in 1910, about that denominationalism is so exotic to the Chinese culture, and how the ministry of the Continuation Committee developed in China. Secondly, we ask students not to limit theological views to the Protestant traditions, but to actively interact with the Catholic and Orthodox traditions as well. We encourage students to read theological works extensively from different traditions. In China, Catholicism and Protestantism are unfortunately misunderstood by common people as two different religions, partly because the name of the same God were translated differently in Catholicism and Protestantism. But we try to help students to get rid of the historical prejudice against each other. We introduce to students the document of John Declaration of Justification of Faith, and master students will read the Catholic Catechism and compare it with the Protestant understandings of faith in systematic theology. We also use textbooks of systematic theology from the Roman Catholic perspectives. We invite Catholic priests to come, sharing about liturgy and their efforts in enculturation. There was even a Catholic priest who came to study biblical hermeneutics and preaching in Nanjing Seminary, which is very unusual in China. Seminary students can also visit Catholic seminaries and have dialogues with them. Furthermore, we also have a special course to introduce Orthodox theology. In the recent years, seminary students have shown great interest, especially in the Eastern Church Fathers, and consequently, master theses were written a lot about Maximus the Confessor, Athanasius, Basil the Great, and Gregory Nyssa, etc. It seems that instead of the Latin soteriological tradition of the forensic notion of justification, Chinese Christians have discovered that the concept of theosis corresponds more to the Chinese cultural temperament of nurturing the ideal personality and seeking this worldly transcendence. Thirdly, as a young uniting church without many historical denomination burdens, we are ready to appropriate ecumenical resources in our teaching according to our own contextual needs. For example, the achievements of faith and order, especially some well-known influential texts, were introduced to students. In the course of systematic theology, we ask students to read such documents as Confessing the One Faith and the Church Towards a Common Vision. In the course of ecclesiology and liturgy, pastoral students and seminarians are required not only to study BAM documents, but also to practice the adapted version of Lima liturgy, which is also used on Sunday worship in the seminary and some urban churches. Fourthly, in order to enrich students' ecumenical perspective, Nanjing seminaries have wide communications with ecumenical churches. We invite foreign visiting professors, either long-term or short-term, to teach in the seminary. They bring with them not only their specialities and the new textbooks, which are conducive to our discipline construction, but also their own denominational background and ecumenical experience for a living interaction. Besides, our faculty members can also go abroad to attend international conferences and WCC meetings. They will share their experience after they return. And in the recent years, the China Christian Council has tried to do some comparative ecclesiologies with other uniting churches in the ecumenical family. For example, conferences were held in Nanjing Seminary together with the Uniting Church of Australia in 2013 and the United Church of Canada in 2015. Seminary students also audited the conferences which broadened their mind in ecumenism. Fifthly, China is traditionally a multicultural and multi-religious country. Interreligious peace is very important for social harmony and economic development. The coexistence of different religions obliges seminaries to ask hard questions about traditional Western understandings of revelation and salvation. Therefore, the exclusive attitude toward other religions taught by former foreign missionaries should be gradually diluted and abandoned. Students need to become fully aware of the danger of religious fundamentalism and extremism. In this aspect, Nanjing Seminary offers courses of religious studies, introduction to Chinese religions, and interfaith dialogue, etc. At the same time, we will bring students to visit the Buddhist and Taoist seminaries and mosques to learn about others' belief and dialogue with them. Finally, in order to contribute to the common good, domestic and global, the seminary has a course on diaconia. Love starts from God, and by humble service, we bear witness to Christ's love in China, whose culture emphasizes very much moral cultivation and decent action, and caring and sharing. Furthermore, Nanjing Seminary also cooperates with the Amity Foundation to hold summer schools of diaconia to train church pastors and workers in the ministry. The training topics include caring the elderly in a fast-aging society, sustainable development according to the 2030 agenda, and environment protection, etc. The Chinese Asian Confucian sage Mencius once said, "Take care of yourself well when you are poor. Share the benefits with the world when you become better off." Although the Chinese churches are still a minority in the world, although we have limited resources, we have not forgotten God's cosmic vision and the responsibility to commit to all under heaven. The Chinese President Xi proposes the building of a world communion of a shared future for humankind, which in Chinese Christians' eyes can also serve the purpose of God's divine economy. In the spirit of caring and cooperation, all human beings as God's created co-creator should continue to take up our stewardship in this world, to respect life, to protect the environment, and to contribute to the world peace in the grace of the triune God. In short, the teaching practice of ecumenism in Nanjing Seminary aims to serve the Chinese churches to develop into an organic and visible unity in order to bear witness to the gospel in the Chinese context. It's actually about the Chinese Christians.
Maybe you try to conclude in a minute so that we leave time for questions.
Yes, thank you very much. When we try to build up our own churches well, we are thinking about the Chinese Christians' contribution to the Catholicity of the church. As the former church leader, Bishop K.H. Dean, who is also one of the pioneers in the Ecumenical Movement, says, "Genuine Catholicity is a process of development. The firmer a national church roots itself among its people, the stronger its individuality, and the more it contributes to the Catholicity of the universal church. So, the three self-principle that the Chinese churches hold firm does not mean self-isolation, but helps to build up a real Chinese uniting church that can have fellowship with other churches on an equal footing and in the spirit of mutual respect, and cooperate with the ecumenical churches to strive for the peaceful and harmonious world. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Reverend Dr. Wenge, for this leading us actually into not only understanding ecumenism, what it means and how it's understood, how it fits into the Chinese context, but exactly you showed us how this is put into practice in the seminary, in the seminaries, in the theological education in the seminaries, but as well practically in a relationship with other Christians, interreligious dialogue, and also diaconia. I mean, you really mentioned that ecumenism has to be understood in terms of a cosmic harmony. It's harmony with the with humanity and harmony with the whole of creation. And you also took us to understand the syncretization of Christianity. And very importantly, the true self does not mean self-isolation, rather enhances the Chinese Christians and Christianity, and also through Chinese Christian ecumenical education or theological education, to embrace and collaborate in a reasonable way with others. Thank you for your presentation. And I will open now the floor for the audience for their questions. Please raise your hand, use the Zoom tool. You raise your hand and we will see you and you will take the floor. And I will plead, try and be concise with your questions so that we can take as many questions as possible. Yeah, Jen Peters, Jenna, the former student of Bosse.
Thank you very much, Father Lawrence. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jenna Peter from the Protestant Church of Maluku in Eastern Indonesia. In the context of Indonesia, and I know it's also shown in several countries in Southeast Asia, Protestant and Catholic distinguish in the level of state policy. And it's also have been formed since the colonial era, added with the political scenario in every island is different in Indonesian context. For example, I came from the Maluku Protestant Church in Eastern Indonesia. It's the largest synod in Eastern Indonesia in the two provinces. Before the Papua, if you see in the map Google's, one of the southeast district in our province, the majority of the community is Catholic and also Protestant in the same percentage. The community is very used to face each other one by one in many problems, especially in political agenda, such as the election of a leader of the district. Ecumenism seems to occur only at the leadership level because it's very easier to talk about ecumenism in the leader level because our theology background. And even the effort about ecumenism in the leader level until now has been carried out for long times and not finished yet, like Professor Dorothea said. How it's possible to talk about ecumenism in the lay level in the church, in the every level, and put into practice, not just in the leadership level. How to interpret and formulate, like Professor Christoph said, that conciliarity and also embrace in the all level of the church, both Protestant and Catholic side. How to embrace the conciliarity with due regard to all representative. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. So, okay, we take this question directly, and then we see. So, who would like to speak to this? Both Professor Dorothea and Christoph were mentioned, but also if Dr. Gay wants. But it's about how do we put ecumenism, bring it to the local level. So who would like to give that? Or do we take another question? Okay. Christoph, okay, Professor Dorothea.
Yes, I try to answer, so I don't know very well your context, but thank you for the questions. The same issue everywhere, I think so. So my idea is to come together and to speak about the life and to share together the answers we find in our Christian faith. So it's possible to come together and in the local level, and so it's my idea, come and see where I live, and in my theological perspective, I prefer the anthropological approaches to ecumenical questions. So we talk about our life and we share the answers of faith, and then we have an ecumenical way. Thank you.
Any of the panelists would want to add something before I go for the other question? Christoph, Professor Christoph, yeah.
If, we all belong in churches that do proclamation. And of course, to the Protestants, it's very close to our heart, the proclamation of the gospel. But of course, it's not an exclusive. It's really shared by all Christians across the world. So how do we proclaim? How do we talk about the church? Can we look at the book of Acts, even if we hear from the historical critical exegetes that the little vignettes on the early disciples may be a little bit of an idealized vision of the early church, of the earliest church? The verse that I quoted from Acts, the disciples devoted themselves to the apostles' teachings and fellowship, koinonia, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. I think we could have church leaders reflect on verses like this one. And maybe on the basis of this, of reflections on verses like this one, following Professor Sattler, what she said, try to visit each other, try to actually have visits of each other, and to debunk the idea that the other is a lesser Christian or not as Christian, to debunk completely these views that are arrogant views. So that would be maybe one possible way.
Thank you, Christoph. Reverend Dr. Gay, you want to?
Yes, thank you very much, Jenny, for your question. But in my context, I think that's very important to educate the seminaries, especially future church pastors, to get rid of this kind of historical prejudice against each other, and to introduce to them the new ecumenical achievements. For example, as I mentioned in my presentation, the document of a joint declaration on justification of faith. And secondly, let the students and the pastors to teach their congregations to appreciate each other, especially, for example, the advantage of meditation, spirituality, And also, the second is in the practical life, we can do diaconia together. In practical cooperation, we can serve the people who are in need. That there will be a very good common witness to the common people in the society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we take a question from Grace Moon.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence. I'm not raising any question, but I want to share my perspective. I have a little different perspective with Jen, with what she raised. You know, in the ground level, in the grassroots level in our community, ecumenical spirit is already exist. But it's the church leaders or theological scholars who are insisting denominationalism. So, you know, we need to revolt or make a reformation of our mindset of our church leaders and theological scholars who are insisting denominational ecumenism. The ecumenical spirit is already exist and developing in the local level because they don't care which church, which denomination they are attending. They just attend the church. They are claiming themselves as church members, not Presbyterian or Methodist or Orthodox. So in this regard, we need to change our perspective a little bit from other way and in other different way. Thank you.
Okay. So, and I also thank you, Grace, for that contribution. That is a contribution to say that there is other way to other context, and also it goes to the question we are dealing with today: contextuality. You know, contexts differ, and the realities differ, and how to take up that when we come to consider the Catholicity, then that becomes the challenge. I think this is a contribution. I will go to Hubert. Hubert, you have a question. I got an indication you have your hands up. Can you?
Yes, thank you. Again, it's not directly a question, it's a comment on this conversation, which I think is extremely essential. You know, and as I was listening to Janet, my thought go back to visits that I've made to isolated churches in the islands of Indonesia. And so I can very much realize, you know, the reality that she was talking about. And I think one way in which, as local congregations in isolated areas, we can open the spirit of people and help them to understand they are part of a Catholic and universal church is to practice a prayer, intercession, that refers to the sister churches that exist everywhere in the world. The Ecumenical Prayer Cycle is a fantastic example of that. And it would help a congregation to realize, you know, that there are Christian communities in many places in the world existing in different circumstances and of different denominations. And when you do that, then there is curiosity and people begin to ask about that. And then you can start a educational process, helping people to see themselves more as members of a Catholic church than only their local congregation.
Thank you. So we take the last question. We are now running out of time from Augustinus. And then Augustinus.
Thank you very much, Professor Lawrence. And also I would love to thank all the three speakers for your wonderful presentations that you had. Actually, I would love to pose a question to Professor Chalamet. Do you believe that Christian churches have truly the will and the desire to be united, if there's the true will, right? The true will, le désir, because that would mean that first that they have to give up, or if you wish to sacrifice their own interests or their historical privileges. And secondly, that also it means that they should re-evaluate or reconsider their own tradition, which in that case would mean that the tradition is their treasure, but at the same time it works as an obstacle towards the unity. So in order something new to be born and to be developed, it needs a new space to be formulated. So how would you name that space, ecclesiologically speaking, and how we could define it in a sense, and if there is such kind of a thing? Thank you very much.
Difficult question you raise, and an important one. Thank you. I don't have a solution or a clear answer. I don't really know about that space that you're talking about at the end. I wish I think it would be something worth discussing together, just to spend an hour one day, all of us together, rather than 10 minutes at the end of 3 presentations that are already saturated our minds. So, but I think, you know, I think there's clearly a desire to maintain our identities. And we have seen what in French we call le repli identitaire in the 80s and 90s. We have seen a strong repli identitaire, a curving back onto our own identities. And that has been simultaneous with the so-called ecumenical winter, which to me is a bit of a myth, because there's some very nice flowers that have emerged during that winter, you know, and we should not forget about them. And so it's become almost a kind of self-serving thing towards a bad slope, a slippery slope towards depression by this, with all this talk of ecumenical winter. So I want to resist a little bit, even though I want also to be realistic about the difficulties that are there. You know, the Rahner-Fries plan of 1983, Eastern 1983, a wonderful text, a powerful text. And look how Protestants dealt with that text when it came out, with Eilert Helms and other in Germany. They just did, no, we don't want that, because we don't want to belong to the Roman hegemony. It's not at all the plan. That's too long. Sorry. So basically, yes, we are very much attached to our structures, historical structures, and it's a big problem. Yeah.
So I will plead with the audience. I will just take within 1 minute to try to see our presenters, whether they have just quickly final word to say, word of thanks or whatever. So maybe I start with you, Christoph, since the presentation was due.
No, I have spoken enough. So,
yeah,
but I'm grateful to Professor Sattler and to
okay.
Professor, yeah.
Okay, Professor Sattler, there you were the second presenter.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here, and please pray for us in the Roman Catholic Church. We are many challenges to remain together in the Roman Catholic Church. It's not easy in these days in the worldwide Christianity to beware the confession Roman Catholic. It's not so easy in the worldwide Church. So pray for us, and we will meet again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sattler. And Reverend Dr. Gabrin.
Thank you, followers. Thank you very much to all, indeed, for this privilege to share the Chinese ecumenism with all of you. Of course, we are also facing many challenges, and let us remember each other in prayers, and let us also pray for today's world when the pandemic influenced so much in people's life. So wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And so, friends, we have come to the end of this session. And just to remind us that we have the second plenary of the day coming up at 3. So we have 25 minutes to get some coffee, and we are back to the same, it's the same Zoom link. So I don't know what whether the technical people behind, whether they will want us to sign out and come in, or we leave ourselves. But if they want, they will communicate that before we leave. But it's just to say thank you to all the organizers, and thank you for being here present. And looking forward to see you at 3 for the other plenary. Thank you. So the information is that we will place everyone in the waiting room during the break, then open again on the hour. So that's the information from the technical communication